Room 30. Signed. Committee 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 Room 30, 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 Committee Room 30, signed. 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 Committee Room 30, Committee Room 30, sound. 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 Committee Room 30, sound.
Okay, thank you. So, meeting will continue in public session, and we're at item number 7, which is Regulation EU 2024-3115 regarding plant health controls and reporting obligations. And we're going to have oral evidence from the department. So, can I just let everybody know that this item will be recorded by a Hansard. So, members, the relevant papers are at pages 6 to 86 of the meeting pack, and also pages 3 to 13 of the table pack. So, Department for Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs assessment of impact is also at pages 3 to 13 of the table pack. And just to remind everybody, the committee will need to take a decision on whether to hold an inquiry, and will do so following the evidence session. So, can I just welcome John Joe Boyle, who's the Chief Executive of Forestry Service, and Charmaine Beer, who's the Head of Plant Health Division within the DERA. And just before I start, can I ask you, we literally received the EM from the British government just this morning, so I'm making an assumption that you have also received that. Okay, thank you. So if you just want to present evidence, and then we'll take questions afterwards.
Okay, thank you, Chair, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to the committee today and to discuss the impact of the amending regulation 2024/3115 regarding plant health. This is amending legislation which sits under Annex 2 of the Windsor Framework. So by way of background, DERA Forest Service, as the competent authority for plant health in Northern Ireland, has a strategic aim to safeguard the plant health status of Northern Ireland, and in doing so contribute to the All-Ireland Single Epidemiological Unit. Safeguarding plant health protects our natural environment, supports our economy and contributes to the well-being of society. This is achieved through implementation of the plant health policy and legislative frameworks which apply risk-based official controls whilst facilitating trade and economic growth. The main legislative basis through which this is achieved is the Plant Health Official Controls and Miscellaneous Provisions Regulations of Northern Ireland 2020, transposed from EU regulations. Following the UK's exit from the EU, the Windsor Framework Agreement continues to apply plant health regulatory requirements in Northern Ireland. Plant health is currently under the control of the Secretary of State, and DERA officials work very closely with those in DEFRA and the other UK nations through the UK Plant Health Common Framework Agreement and other official networks. The Common Framework provides the UK-wide forum to discuss and agree plant health policy. In addition, officials work very closely with counterparts in the Republic of Ireland. There are 23 protected zones in Northern Ireland for unwanted plant and tree pests and pathogens. These zones, approved by the Commission, demonstrate the region is free from specific pests and pathogens present in other European countries, and the high number of Northern Ireland protected zones indicates our good plant health status. The protective zones bring additional restrictions to prevent quarantine pests entering and establishing here, such as bark beetles, oak processionary moth, and pests of potatoes and other growing crops. Moving on to the EU legislation, this is amending legislation which sits under Annex 2 of the Windsor Framework, as I've already stated. The Regulation 2024-3115, before you for scrutiny today, is amending Regulation EU 2016-2031 on protective measures against pests of plants, known as the EU Plant Health Regulation, as regards reporting requirements and procedures for implementing controls in respect of certain high-risk plants. This also amends Regulation EU 2017-625, the Official Controls Regulation, as regards certain notifications of non-compliance. The changes are to enhance effectiveness and transparency and practical implementation of the EU plant health regulatory system, but do not change overall plant health policy. So I'll now outline some further details of the legislative amendments, if that's okay, Chair. The principal change being introduced is an electronic notification system and reporting tool which will be used to directly inform the Commission of annual returns, including multi-annual surveys and pest outbreaks. Monitoring and surveillance plans and reports will also be submitted electronically, as will contingency plans. This will also include information on derogations to the movement of plants and plant material. This electronic process will be beneficial for submitting DERA plant health annual returns to the EU, with information being more streamlined and also more accessible for use and reactive response when needed. The amendments establish an Union Plant Health Emergency Team to provide Member States with urgent assistance concerning new outbreaks of quarantine pests. This will include technical, scientific and laboratory support and may extend to third countries where the risk justifies EU intervention to protect EU territory. The amendments provide the Commission with the powers to take immediate actions to prohibit pests it determines as high risk from entering any Member States or Northern Ireland territory without requiring an EU implementing act or additional national legislation. This will enhance pest control by simplifying the making of legislation, which strengthens regulatory controls. Under these powers, a derogation can be requested to an EU prohibition specific to a plant or plant product identified as high risk in certain EU territories. This risk will be based on an evidence dossier and written request indicating a lower level of risk for the territory making the application. Where a Member State can provide evidence, the EU can permit a derogation, provided the applicant fulfills the dossier and reporting requirements. This derogation can be for up to 5 years and is dependent on no objections from other Member States to its establishment. The derogation may be revoked at any time by the EU if it's deemed appropriate to do so. For plants and plant products moving into the EU with any such derogation, phytosanitary certificates known as PCs must include on the additional declarations all details of the derogation under which the item is entering the Member State. A derogation can also facilitate the movement of prohibited products within the EU if this is supported by a plant passport under the normal EU plant passporting arrangements. The amendment also enables the use of digitised phytosanitary certificates, PCs, on the EU system to cover the movement from the border control point to the place of destination, rather than issuing an authenticated paper or electronic copy, as is currently required under Article 50 of EU 2017-625, which can be used in conjunction with the International Plant Protection Convention Hub used by EU countries for digitised PCs. We already have compatibility for this change in Northern Ireland and for trade with GB. Regarding the amendment to Regulation EU 2017-625, the Official Controls Regulations, this exempts a member state from notifying a non-compliance to the Commission when this relates to personal baggage or postal movements for personal consumption if the non-compliance is the absence of a phytosanitary certificate or other required verification to reduce regulatory burden. Under certain circumstances where a risk has been verified, specific import requirements for moving plants and other goods into Northern Ireland may change in line with EU temporary measures. This could include a requirement for PCs accompanying regulated goods moving GB to NI to include additional declarations to state how they comply with EU requirements for regulated non-quarantine pests. I'll now move on to the impact of this regulation on Northern Ireland. Application of these amendments to Northern Ireland would not have a significant impact specific to everyday life of communities, as the amendments being introduced do not amend existing plant health policy but set out improvements to application of existing policy which have applied in Northern Ireland since 2016. The amendments improve existing policy application by introducing digital EU reporting arrangements for the existing plant health regulatory regime. These amendments provide an option for a derogation for certain prohibited products and exempt notifications of certain non-compliances relating to the officials' control regulations to the Commission. The explanatory memorandum clarifies there is no impact on goods moved from Great Britain to Northern Ireland with a Northern Ireland plant health label. Moreover, in line with the Government's commitment to ensuring Northern Ireland traders have unfettered access to the rest of the UK internal market, these measures will in no way impede the movement of qualifying Northern Ireland goods from Northern Ireland to Great Britain. UK Government includes in its explanatory memorandum that because of certain flexibilities offered by this regulation, some businesses may benefit from reduced cost incurred in moving plants and plant products. It clarifies that DEFRA is considering the changes made by these regulations and confirms they will consider whether there is any benefit in introducing similar changes. Thank you very much. We're happy to take questions.
Okay, thank you. So I'm kind of paraphrasing. Overall, the main objective of this legislation is about improving processes rather than altering policy, and those were your words, and you've highlighted the measures from the British Government's explanatory memorandum, which is saying the measures will affect arrangements to reduce operational burdens and improve clarity, and this will provide flexibilities to stakeholders here in the north. So can I ask you, I mean that's what the implementation of the legislation is about. If we didn't apply this legislation here, can I ask what the impacts would be?
So if we didn't apply this legislation, we'll end up out of sync with the digital systems that are being set up. It would mean that we'd be slower to respond, we'd have less information flowing into the EU network, and I suppose it would just, we wouldn't be optimised in our plant health responses.
So, and that would impact traders and businesses here?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Anybody? Jonathan?
Thank you, and thank you very much. Firstly, I suppose probably, so what GB plants are deemed at risk from entering Northern Ireland territory at present?
What plants are deemed at risk? Do you want to take this one, John?
Yeah, certainly. There's quite a spectrum of plants that are deemed at risk, and they are they're classified. There's a list of plants that continue. Gets updated based on risk assessment and changes that are seen across European countries, etc. So there is a list there that often gets amended to add a new plant or a new risk coming through. So, I mean, there was a couple just mentioned there in passing, things like oak processionary moth, for an example. That has been found in GB at a particular time and eradicated, and we don't have that sort of pest here in Northern Ireland. Other examples are in relation to there's a nips, which is a beetle that attacks trees, and that's fairly common in some GB parts, most of GB in fact, with the exception of an area right up on the west coast of Scotland that is still deemed to be still has a protected zone status up there. So there is risk of those kind of beetles, for example, that we don't have here, affecting forests or woodlands here in Northern Ireland, coming here.
So maybe to make it more specific for you,
Okay.
what particular plants are now deemed at risk post-Brexit trading conditions with the Windsor framework that weren't deemed at risk before that? Is there anything that comes to mind in particular?
Well, the plant health issues aren't really changed because of EU exit. They're as they were. We had already got protected zone status before EU exit, and we still have those protected zone status. A lot of the plants, a lot of the issues around plant health disease is about the organisms that transport with the plants, not the plants themselves. Yeah, so or forests or trees or natural environment can be potentially at risk to, as I say, maybe beetles, those kind of organisms that exist in those same plants in GB, but don't exist on our plants here in Northern Ireland.
What's the level of trade between GB and Northern Ireland in relation to the transferring of plants, for example?
Well, there's quite a lot of plants still move from Northern Ireland, from GB to Northern Ireland. Those
Have you got a
I don't have a figure. No, I don't have a figure. But there is quite a lot of plants that move unregulated. Yeah, and then there is the regulated plants. So the regulation is about regulating the regulated plants. Yeah.
Just, I mean, I don't want to get into a whole policy discussion about plant health. You know, this is a very specific regulation that we're looking at. So, I mean, if I could ask that we keep our questions specific to that.
So my understanding is that the regulation will impact GB businesses whose plant seeds move to Northern Ireland and require a phytosanitary certificate. I'm right on that?
Well, this regulation is about changing. It doesn't change any of the regulation that's imposed. It simply changes the IT, the handling of that, the how that is regulated, and the notification. It's the notification issues around that.
Yeah, administration.
So it has been stated that for plants that are staying within the UK internal market, that move to Northern Ireland with a plant health label, for example, that they won't be impacted.
No,
so what I'm trying to ascertain, so obviously that's business to business.
Yes.
So for business to consumer, will they be impacted?
That's a Windsor framework issue. That's not this regulation issue. Yeah.
But it's covered. So for the overall regulation covers the movement of plants and the administrative and the barriers that they may face entering the Northern Ireland market.
Yeah, under the NIFL arrangements, the plants that move from a business have to move to a registered business in Northern Ireland. They don't move from a business to an individual consumer under the NIFL scheme.
So business to business, unaffected if they have a Northern Ireland plant label. Yeah. But for business to consumer, I mean, we have all faced issues, I'm sure other members have, where we have constituents that cannot access, for example, seeds that they used to buy in the GB market. This regulation, will that have any material impact on their ability to access?
This regulation doesn't impact this one way or the other. It stays the same.
Stays the same.
It stays the same. Yeah.
So they still have the barriers in place.
They're still subject to the Windsor framework arrangements. Yeah.
Thank you.
Steve?
Just a quick one. Sort of electronic notification. So obviously it's moving towards a digital-based process. Who does that?
So there's sort of networks of that information. So there's a European network and there's an international network as well that GB access, and they're compatible with each other.
Yeah. But who specifically does it in Northern Ireland?
So in terms of as a competent authority, we'll be making reports onto that system.
Okay, so you do that now?
Yes.
Okay, so there'll be no change. You've got the systems, you got the IT, and you didn't buy it off Fujitsu, thank goodness. What were you looking at?
That's right. That falls to the competent authority to do it. What this does is enable us to do it more streamlined, more digital, using a more integrated digital platform.
Okay, yeah. And just for my own information management system for official controls, is that what that is?
Yeah. That's the system that's in place across in a UK at a UK level.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And that talks to the EU system?
It does, yeah.
Okay, okay, thanks. Cheers.
Peter and then Owen. Peter.
Thanks very much, Chair. I have just a couple of questions for the officials. The first one really is in the initial evidence that was given there. My sense, and I didn't scribble down exactly what the official said, was that it wouldn't have very much impact in terms of the movement of goods, and officials can correct if I'm badly paraphrasing that. But in the EM point 4, it does state that the proposed measures will impact the process of exporting certain goods from GB to the EU, as well as moving goods to Northern Ireland unless moved by the Green Lane. I mean, is the evidence that this won't have a significant impact, or it will have a significant impact?
There's no evidence that it will have a significant impact. The systems are already in place for these movements. So there's scope within this regulation for, say, a new pest comes into concern. There may be extra restrictions put on something like that, extra documentation. Those sorts of things, I think, is what it's referring to in the EM. But it's not actually changing the existing system that we have for those movements of goods that already flow in.
Okay, that's very useful. Just staying on that point 4 of the EM, there's a line there that says, consequently, providing the legal power to adopt procedural rules on how to submit and examine a request for granting temporary derogations. Mm-hmm. And then the next point says, providing the legal power to adopt rules in the process for identifying and listing high-risk plants. I mean, I don't know. I've learned what high-risk plants are. Whenever I first read that, I thought they might be triffids, maybe a cultural reference that's lost in the committee. But it does look on those 2 points that I've just read out that new powers could be adopted. How would those powers be adopted?
So that really refers to the fact that a member state can make a request for derogation if they deem that plant is low risk for them. So that might be, if we don't have a host plant here for a certain pest, it would be deemed a low risk movement. So, we could make a case in that scenario for derogation if we provide the right evidence to do so. So if that answers your question on that, the EU, what this amendment is really trying to do is bring in more agileness, I suppose, to the system. The system's been in place in 2016. The EU and all nations are concerned about plant health risk and want to be able to move quite swiftly when they need to. So that's what that is really. But it's also not overburdening then every nation, so they could apply for specific derogations if we had good evidence that a certain pest or disease wasn't of concern for us. Okay.
So in summary there, it's effectively of benefit to the EU, not necessarily to us in Northern Ireland. It helps the EU in terms of the efficiency and agileness of the process. That'd be fair?
We would also have the ability to apply for derogations for Northern Ireland if we saw that would be reduce a regulatory burden, for example, that wasn't needed because we didn't have the threat of a certain pest that other nations in Europe would have.
Okay.
And if I can add, just add, it would allow the member state, ourselves included in this case, to make that application and for a streamlined process in order to allow that to be granted or considered by EU, as opposed to through the wider overall EU process that would have been there previously.
Okay, that's fine. Final question: have DERA consulted on this with any stakeholders in Northern Ireland in terms of the impact?
No, we haven't consulted specifically on this regulation.
Okay, and is that usual for something like this?
I suppose because this is mainly technical amendments that really mainly impact the competent authority in terms of how they would report things to the EU. It wouldn't have a wider sort of stakeholder reach. So it wouldn't be unusual. It wouldn't be unusual for these sorts of technical amendments.
And who's the competent authority?
ERA is the competent authority for plant health in Northern Ireland.
Okay, but as my colleague, Mr. Buckley, said in his questioning, these are maybe business-to-business movements, but there surely must be businesses affected in some way in Northern Ireland. Would it not have been expeditious to ask those businesses what their view of these regulations might be?
Yeah, we have certain stakeholder forums across the UK where there will be regular meetings and updates on these sorts of regulations, but we haven't specifically consulted on this amendment.
Okay, so no, just to be clear, so no businesses were consulted on this particular amendment in Northern Ireland in terms of the impact on trade or movement?
Not specifically.
Okay,
Idea.
that's great. Thank you very much, Chair.
Okay, Owen.
Thank you, Chair. And it just actually builds on a point that Peter raised, although I'm looking at the updated EM, but it deals with a similar issue. It's paragraph 16, and it's talking about that point in relation to the powers granted for seeking temporary derogation and special import requirements. My question really is just to understand, how does that compare to the current process? Is there a process currently for an exemption to be sought formally, or is this a new introduction?
This is newer, and it would be a lot less burdensome. So what can happen here is it's more of a precautionary approach. So if you think you've got a problem, you can start to act while you collect the evidence for it.
Okay. And so if you were concerned about potentially a plant that we wanted for whatever reason to move from GB into Northern Ireland that was deemed high risk, this actually provides us with a pathway to address that issue?
Yes.
Okay, that's me, Chair. Thank you.
Good job. Anybody else? Okay. Thank you. Just before you leave, some of the evidence or some of the witnesses are the same for item number 9. So I'm going to ask members if once we finish with this item, that if it's okay, we go to item 9 to see if the witnesses are going and coming back again.
I'm content, thank you. Yeah.
Okay. So, members, just when I get myself right here. So, under paragraph 8.1 of Schedule 6B of the 1998 Act, the committee must decide today whether or not to hold an inquiry into the published Replacement EU Act that has been notified, and should the committee fail to decide, the failure will be treated as a decision not to hold an inquiry. So can I just ask the question then, having regard to the legal advice on whether it appears likely that the Replacement EU Act significantly differs in whole or in part from the content or scope of the EU instruments which it amends or replaces, and also the departmental assessment whether it appears likely that the Replacement Act would have a significant impact specific to everyday life of communities here in a way that is liable to persist, do members wish to hold an inquiry into Regulation EU 2024-3115 on plant health? Jonathan?
I would propose that we do hold an inquiry.
Okay. And Owen?
Just to state, Chair, I'd be opposed to holding an inquiry on the basis both of the legal advice that we received today and the evidence from the department.
Okay, so we've two proposals. Going to take Jonathan's first. Okay, so can I ask those in favour of Jonathan's proposal that we hold an inquiry, if they could raise their hand?
Okay.
And those opposed?
Okay, the question was that inquiry is held into the regulation of plant health. Ayes, David Brooks, Jonathan Buckley, Peter Martin, Steve Aiken, Noes, Philip McGuigan, Emma Sheeran, Owen Tennyson. So the proposal is carried.
Okay. So, members, just to refer to the inquiry timeline, that's at page 82 of the meeting pack. Are members happy to consider and agree the inquiry timeline, which includes scheduling oral evidence session with departmental officials on the 16th of January and agreeing to a final report on the 23rd of January? Okay, and can I seek agreement for the views on a citizen-based survey from key representatives of business and civil society identified by Raise at page 85 of the meeting pack with a closing date of 19th of January? Okay. And also, just to let you know, the citizen-based survey will be promoted on social media platforms, and anyone will be able to respond. So in line with agreed procedures, views on the EU Act and its impact on committee here, and details of the position in England, Scotland and Wales will be requested from the British Government. So, got that. Okay, so we have agreed to skip item 8 and move to item number 9. So this is regulation relating to the date of application on Departmental Oral Evidence, and just to remind members that again Hansard will be recording this. So members, the relevant papers are at pages 245 to 268 of the meeting pack and pages 24 to 30 of the table pack. So again we have members from DERA to provide an assessment of impact, and they have written to us, and that can be found at pages 254 to 263 of the meeting pack. Committee will need to take a decision on whether to hold an inquiry, and will do so following the evidence session. So can I ask the witnesses to come forward? I think we have Charmaine again and John Joe, and they're joined by Catherine Fisher, who's Director of Windsor Framework Implementation Director within DERA. So I'm just going to hand over to yourselves to provide us with some evidence, and then we'll take questions.
Yes, I'm going to give the opening remarks. So thank you for the invitation to speak to you today. So I'm going to start by giving you some background on the EU deforestation regulation. So Regulation EU 2023-1115 on the making available on the market, on the union market, and the export from the union of certain commodities and products associated with deforestation and forest degradation, and repealing Regulation EU 995/2010, commonly referred to as the EU Deforestation Regulation, or EUDR in short, was adopted to reduce deforestation and forest degradation. The EUDR lays down rules regarding the placing and making available in the union market, as well as the export from the union market of relevant products that contain, have been fed with, or have been made with the following commodities: cattle, cocoa, coffee, oil palm, rubber, soya and wood. In particular, the regulation aims to ensure that those commodities and relevant products are placed or made available on the EU market or exported only if they are deforestation free, have been produced in accordance with the relevant legislation of the country of production, and covered by a due diligence statement. Most of the provisions of the EUDR were to apply from 30th of December 2024. Following engagement with Member States and stakeholders, the Commission proposed to postpone the application of the regulation by 12 months to allow third countries, Member States, operators and traders to be fully prepared, including to allow those operators and traders to establish the necessary due diligence systems covering all relevant commodities and products. The regulation which is being considered today, that is Regulation EU 2024-3234 of the European Parliament and of the Council of 19th December 2024, amending Regulation EU 2023-1115 as regards provisions relating to the date of application, postpones the application date of the EUDR by 12 months to 30th of December 2025. Both the EUDR and Regulation EU 2024-3234 are primarily focused on the trade of goods and their impact on global forestation, and as such they are fully reserved with responsibility sitting with the UK Government. The Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, DEFRA, currently leads on the EUDR. DERA has received queries from businesses on the detail of the application of EUDR, which the Department has passed to DEFRA, and DEFRA has advised that the UK Government will communicate the relevant arrangements at the earliest possible opportunity. The EU and the UK Government are still in discussions as to the extent of which the EUDR will apply in Northern Ireland, and the EUDR has not yet formally been added to the Windsor framework. Once these discussions and processes are complete, you will be given the opportunity to scrutinise the EUDR and its impact here if its addition to the Windsor framework is agreed. So moving on to the regulation being considered today, Regulation EU 2024-3234 is only concerned with the postponement of the dates of the application within the EUDR. That is, the postponement by 12 months of the date of application set out in Article 38.2 of the EUDR, and the dates in interlinked provision of that regulation, namely the dates provided for the repeal of Regulation EU 995/2010 now 30th of December 2025. And for the deferred application of the provision referred to in that paragraph to micro undertakings or small undertakings, now 30th of June 2026. And the postponement by 6 months until 30th of June 2025 of the classification by the Commission of countries or parts thereof that present a low or a high risk, to provide operators and traders with the information on assignment of risk well in advance of the date from which their due diligence obligation will apply. So moving on to the impact on Northern Ireland, given the current lack of clarity on the extent of the application of the EUDR in Northern Ireland, at this time, the delay on the implementation being applied through Regulation EU 2024-3234 is most welcome. The 12-month postponement will enable the discussions between the UK Government and the EU to conclude, the clarity on the extent of the application to be confirmed, and for DEFRA to provide the relevant arrangement to traders and operators in a more timely manner. It does appear likely that the delay to the implementation of the EUDR through the application of Regulation EU 2024-3234 would not have a significant impact specific to everyday life of communities in Northern Ireland in a way that is liable to persist, and there would be no change to the current position. If the EUDR was to apply in Northern Ireland, it would be likely that not applying the Replacement EU Act, Regulation EU 2024-3234, would place Northern Ireland operators and traders impacted by the regulation at a disadvantage compared to the rest of the EU. In such a circumstance, Northern Ireland would be the only place in the EU where the implementation of the EUDR would not be delayed. So I hope you find this short overview useful.
Okay, Catherine, thank you very much. That was very useful, particularly the last bit. I mean, this committee, when we're notified about EU legislation that's going to be applied here, have certain criteria in terms of impact, legal advice in terms of impact, and then advice from the departments with regard to specific negative impacts that may be liable to persist. And then based on that evidence that we hear and the legal advice, we are supposed to, and I use the word supposed to, apply criteria, but whether to hold an inquiry or not. So that's the basis of our job, and you've been very clear that the application of this will have no negative impact that's liable to persist. So I appreciate that. Thank you. David?
Yes, thanks very much, Chair. And similarly, I guess from my own point of view and from our party's point of view, I want to place on record that we would have had deep concerns about the overarching legislation that predates obviously our rule, and therefore we don't have a role in scrutinising that because of the perhaps disproportionate weight of due diligence requirements upon our businesses that are sourcing and supplying timber in particular. Problematic in particular because of our geography and topography here. But just to be clear, the impact of this, from what you're saying, is to actually give just a delay and actually more time for those businesses to try and get whatever they need to get in place to deal with those regulations, so it's not going to have a negative impact upon them. Is that right?
Correct, yes.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Steve?
Yeah, okay, just for clarity. We're not in the EUDR yet, are we? Because it hasn't been attached to the Windsor framework. So we're sitting outside it.
The EUDR is in place, but it's not at its implementation date. And that's what this regulation here is.
But it hasn't actually been added to the body of the Windsor framework yet.
No.
So we're looking at a delay in legislation that doesn't apply to us yet because it hasn't been incorporated in the Windsor framework.
That's right.
Right. Okay. Thanks for that.
Jonathan?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you very much for your evidence. I appreciate setting out the context. Obviously, it's a unique position the committee find itself in, given that it is on the delayed implementation rather than the actual regulation itself, the deforestation regulation. So, could I ask, the actual deforestation regulation itself, do the department have a view on how it may have impacted the people of Northern Ireland, both consumers, business?
Sure.
I think the regulation, as you've rightly said yourself, is that we're obviously here to give witness to is very much the extension issue. The regulation, the original regulation that you've said there, that particular regulation is something that is already there but not added to the Windsor framework, and that process, or that has to continue in terms of the UK government dealing with taking that through with the EU in terms of how and what that looks like when it actually comes to fruition. So we're not, as said by your colleague, we're not in that regulatory space at this point in time.
No, I find it interesting. Obviously, Catherine gave quite a detailed context, as do some of the policy documents and memorandums that we've been reading. So I'm just keen to know if the department had a view on that actual deforestation regulation. But if you're saying that they don't wish to comment on that at this stage,
I think what we're saying is that we don't know how that would be intended to work out, and that is still to be established between the EU and the UK government.
But has there been any work done from a department perspective, given that this is a delaying regulation? Surely the department would have some view on the original.
No, we haven't. We have, because we aren't yet made aware of how it's intended to be applied.
And the responsibility sits with the UK government. So it's not a because it's a trade matter. The department isn't the responsible department. It's DEFRA. So we're liaising with DEFRA and asking them questions. But until the discussion between the EU and the UK concludes, then we don't really know how it will.
There is, and I'll finish on this point, but there is no actual departmental assessment of what the original deforestation regulation, how it would impact both businesses and consumers in Northern Ireland. There is none that exists. Am I right in saying that?
Yeah, right, yeah.
Okay.
Okay, members, just again under paragraph 8.1 of Schedule 6B of the 1998 Act. Sorry, I should let you go before I go through this here. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Just for clarification, and maybe it's just because it's a new year, but we're actually looking to do something on the EUDR that hasn't actually been adopted as part of the Windsor framework yet. So we're being asked to look at a process that's going to delay the implementation of something we're not actually implemented in yet.
Go ahead.
There's part of that would have been subject to a replacement act. The time frame for that has been and gone, so that is there. That but this will be subject to an applicability motion, the Article 13.4 elements.
Because we have to have an applicability motion to bring it into the scope of the Windsor framework, but that hasn't been passed yet. So
the new elements, yes.
The new elements. So everything to do with the EUDR that we're being asked to look at for the delay in the implementation isn't even part of the Windsor framework yet.
Yeah, but the replacement acts, the replacement, I mean that's in existence. If negotiations between the EU and the UK government last well beyond a year, that do you know what I'm trying to say? That we're.
I'm not trying to be difficult, but the problem I have with this is that we're being asked to look at a delaying piece. We're to recognise the fact that a piece of legislation is likely to be delayed up to, but we aren't. That piece of legislation isn't actually before us because it's not in the Windsor framework. So how do we have the virus to be doing this?
There are parts of that, the UDR, or replacement legislation, that's already. The law, it just hasn't been enacted, implemented
because it's being delayed by this.
Yes,
but that law has to come in front of the Assembly as part of applicability motion for us to accept.
No, that's the new elements.
The first one doesn't.
The new elements of it.
But the next bit, the EUDR itself, is part of the has to come through as an applicability motion.
Not in its entirety. The new elements of it. So, correct me if I'm wrong, officials, that the elements that were subject to the Replacement Act will come in force in line with the original,
which is already in place. Yes,
which is already in place. Yep. So, am I right in saying that the implications would be that if this regulation wasn't to come into effect here we would be subject to earlier implementation dates, the original implementation dates.
I think to go to your point, if this regulation isn't voted through, then if the EU and UK discussions conclude and it is agreed that the UDR applies, then we won't benefit from the delay. While it doesn't apply yet, once it is agreed, then it would apply here earlier than in other parts of the EU if the discussions conclude.
But it's because it's a part of an applicability motion, it has to come across before the Assembly to vote on it, or else it won't.
New elements only.
New elements
only.
Yeah.
But part of the EUDR replace an earlier EU legislation.
So, I mean, I know it's slightly complicated, but our choice today is whether we delay this or don't delay it. And it's not our choice today, but that's what we're voting on today in terms of whether we have an inquiry or not. We're not stopping the EUDR. We're talking about applying the derogation that is across the EU.
To be delayed, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Everybody clear?
No.
it's well, I'm clear in the role of the committee, to be frank. So I mean that's the important thing. If people are clear on the role of the committee today.
Sure. Can I ask before? Obviously, we're going towards whether or not we'll conduct an inquiry or not. So can I just ask for clarity, just again from this committee secretariat?
What we're doing.
The potential inquiry, if voted on by the committee, would be an inquiry into the delayed implementation. Would the inquiry give us the ability to examine and study the impact of the original deforestation regulation?
No.
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 Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Officials, for the second time, thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks.
So, and this is why I read this out, because it has to be clear in terms of our remit. So under paragraph 8.1 of Schedule 6B to the 1998 Act, the committee today must decide whether or not to hold an inquiry into the published replacement EU Act that has been notified, and should the committee fail to decide, the failure will be treated as a decision not to hold inquiry. And I'm going to read this again in bold, if you can hear my reading it in bold. The committee must have regard to the legal advice on whether it appears likely that the replacement EU Act significantly differs in whole or in part from the content or scope of the EU instruments which it amends or replaces, and secondly, the departmental assessment on whether it appears likely that the replacement act would have a significant impact specific to everyday life of communities here in a way that is liable to persist. So, do members wish to hold an inquiry into Regulation EU 2024-3115, the provisions relating to the date of application? Owen?
I propose, Chair, that we don't hold an inquiry.
Yeah.
Sure, I just want to place on record that we're content not to have the inquiry on the basis that it will just deal with the delay, but our concerns over the overarching legislation remain, but that as the clerk has outlined, that is not going to be something that the inquiry would allow us to deal with.
Okay, Steve?
Yes, just want to put on record, I'm not going to force it to a vote one way or another. My particular reason I would like recorded is because I think there's a degree of greyness here about the applicability of this, because it hasn't yet been adopted by, elements of it haven't yet been adopted by the Assembly, which has to become before the Assembly before it's incorporated in the Windsor framework. We're being asked to look at something that's theoretical and hasn't been given any substance. There are elements that have been given it substance, but the whole article hasn't been given substance. I think this is something that we need to look at closely, because if there's more of these things that are coming through, we need to be fully aware of what we're voting for and why we're voting for it.
Okay, so there's a proposal from Owen that we don't have an inquiry, and unless there's an alternative proposal, we're not going to have an inquiry. Okay, thank you. So,
Sure.
Sorry, Jimmy, come back to you.
I was just going to suggest that I think, I mean, I'll be honest, I haven't fully got my head around.
No, I haven't.
So, I think it's an interesting point from colleague there, and wonder if we could get advice on if those kind of things are coming forward in future, why it is the way it is, and what in terms of, as Steve has laid out, in terms of if there are things that fall at the moment outside the remit technically of the Windsor framework, how then it falls within our remit. So it's just so I'm not doubting I'm taking in good faith the advice that we have, but I don't. It's an interesting point.
Yeah.
I don't think it necessarily would have led me to an inquiry, because I don't think an inquiry would have dealt with
No,
that.
no, it's just.
But I just think it's an interesting point to try and get my head around.
Are members content if we seek legal advice on it?
Yeah, so just for clarity, Chair, I'm not trying to be difficult about this, but we are the Windsor Framework Democratic Scrutiny Committee. There's elements of this that are not in the Windsor Framework yet. So we were being asked to look at those specifically. They're not in the Windsor Framework. So I think there are grey areas there that I think we probably needed grey clarity on.
I think legal advice might help us all get our heads around that. One last point from me that did cause me a bit of concern. Whilst I recognise the officials were before today to talk about the delay rather than the original, when I probed further and asked the point, did the department have an impact assessment on the original? They said that they didn't. That would cause me concern, given that it has now passed. So surely to goodness the department would know what the impact potentially may or may not be, hence their support for a delay. I think that's concerning.
Okay, so what we're going to do, we've agreed, is we will seek legal advice on that particular point of clarification. So, members, we're now going back then to item number 8, which is the regulation EU on harmonised rules for the marketing of construction products, and we were supposed to have departmental oral evidence. Can I just inform members that the relevant papers for this item are at pages 87 to 244 of the meeting pack and pages 14 to 23 of the table pack. So the Department of Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs, Department for Finance and Department for Infrastructure have all provided assessments of impact, which can be found at pages 237 to 239 of the meeting pack. However, the departments have indicated through the Executive Office that they aren't going to field officials for today's meeting. So, at the request of the clerk, clarifications were received from the Department of Finance and the Department of Infrastructure, respectively, in relation to their assessments, and they have been provided to members yesterday afternoon through the table papers. In an email to the Executive Office, which the Executive Office circulated to the departments, the clerk reiterated that the committee fundamentally doesn't accept that departments can't offer a view on the likely impact of a replacement EU Act in respect of reserved or accepted matters. So a copy of that email was included as part of the papers circulated to members today. But despite that, no officials from any of the three departments are in attendance today. So I'm going to be talking about this matter later because myself and the Vice Chair had a meeting with Minister Murphy under Chair's business. So if people are content, we can deal with the totality of that then, with regard to the department's contact and interaction with the committee. Okay, so people are content with that. So can I just remind members the committee will need to take a decision on whether to hold an inquiry today based on what written evidence we have received and our legal advice. So under paragraph 8.1 of Schedule 6B to the 1998 Act, the committee must decide today whether or not to hold an inquiry into the published replacement EU Act that has been notified, and should the committee fail to decide, the failure will be treated as a decision not to hold an inquiry. So, once again, having regard to the legal advice on whether it appears likely that the replacement EU Act significantly differs in whole or in part from the content or scope of the EU instruments which it amends or replaces, and the departmental assessments on whether it appears likely that the Replacement Act would have a significant impact specific to everyday life of communities here in a way that is liable to persist, do members wish to hold an inquiry into Regulation EU 2024-3115, the marketing of construction products? Jonathan.
Chair, yes, I would propose that we do hold an inquiry based on legal advice and also the written evidence which suggests an impact on increased costs for businesses of some 8%. So I would propose an inquiry.
Okay, Steve?
Agreed. Support that.
Okay, Owen?
Agree on this one, Chair, and really largely driven by a lack of information primarily, that I think we do need to do some further work.
Okay, grand. So there's no alternative proposals. So can I just let members know the inquiry timeline is at page 240 of the meeting pack. So can we agree the timeline, which includes scheduling oral evidence sessions with departmental officials on the 16th of January next week. For information, departments must comply with any reasonable request made by a committee which is relevant to an inquiry. So that might negate the issue today. So that's part of the timeline. Inquiry sessions next week, and agreeing the final report on the 23rd of January.
Great.
And then also, can I seek agreement for views on the Act via citizen space survey from key representatives from business and civil society, identified by RAISE at page 243 of the meeting pack, again with a closing date of the 19th of January. Happy?
Sure. On that, I also can't find it right now, but I did read that on an original proposal surrounding this, there was something like a percentage of UK businesses that actually corresponded with the EU pre-exit in relation to this matter. I would be interested to hear their views reflected in some way, and if we can gather that information.
Okay. So,
Construction Federation.
yeah.
Sorry, through the chair and for the clerk, maybe the Construction Federation will have some view on that, just to ease the process.
Yeah. They were they not included in the RAISE?
No, I think there is a Northern Ireland Construction Federation, but there's a
okay.
UK one.
Okay. So everybody's content with that?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm now at item 10.
No.
Oh.
Page 13, you've missed.
Oh, sorry, I got confused there when I was.
You just do it, it's just a wee.
Go ahead, Claire.
Okay, and so in line with agreed processes, views on the Act and its impact on communities here, and details of position in England, Scotland and Wales will be requested from the British Government. But are members content that the suggested questions that were prepared for today's evidence session are tailored and sent to the British Government then for answer?
Yep.
Okay. So am I now at item 10?
Yeah, sorry.
Yep.
We go.
Sorry about that, member. So we're now at item 10 on the agenda, which is a proposal for regulation as regards the strengthening of the positioning of farmers in the food supply chain. So can I refer members to pages 272 to 299 of the meeting pack? The committee was notified on the 2nd of January of this proposed replacement EU Act on strengthening of the position of farmers in the food supply chain. It's a proposed replacement EU Act. The proposed EU Act would amend a series of existing EU regulations related to the Common Agricultural Policy, including one EU Act, which is EU 1303-2013, which is relevant to the work of this committee. So can I ask if members are content, in line with agreed procedures, that legal advice and an initial departmental assessment of impact are requested with a time frame of 1 month from now to assist the committee in deciding on whether to monitor the proposal?
Agreed.
Okay. The committee will consider whether to monitor the proposal in due course when we get that information.
Through the chair, which point do we should we also be sending this to the Agriculture Committee as well? Because of the, I mean, I'm struggling to understand all the sort of the various bits of it until we've had evidence and the rest of it. But would it be worth sending it to the DERA Committee as well, just for them to scrutinise it? Because it seems to be quite substantial. It refers to replacements, Common Agriculture Policy. It refers to improving sort of the role of the farmer, but it's a bit. I think this could actually be something quite a large piece of work to look at, and I think all the help we can get would be very useful.
Yeah, I think. I mean, there are issues that are wider than the work of this committee, because it's the series of existing regulations. Yeah. But obviously, we'd need to be careful that another committee isn't scrutinising what we're going to be doing. Yeah. But so, if you're content, we could forward it on to the DERA Committee just for information, and it can decide itself then if it wishes to do anything.
Yeah.
Okay. So correspondence then, page 301 to 307 of the meeting pack is an update from the Executive Office in relation to current proposed EU legislation relevant to here, and at pages 31 to 36 of the table pack is an updated version of the table which includes input from DERA that has now been cleared by DEFRA. So this information will assist the committee in its next prioritisation exercise on proposed EU acts that began their legislative passage before the committee was established. So for information, the Executive Office intends to share this update with RAISE after the committee has had sight of the updated table. Are members content to note?
Happy.
Okay. At pages 308 of the meeting pack is correspondence from NAAC to the clerk regarding a rolling inquiry that is launched into the operation of the Windsor framework. The correspondence notes that the Affairs Committee at Westminster is currently inviting written responses with the plan to hold periodic oral evidence sessions on different aspects of the Windsor framework thereafter. So, as we have already agreed to include a meeting with NIAC in the programme for our next visit to Westminster, for our visit to Westminster, which is likely to take place next month, are members content to note as operation of the committee will likely form part of the discussions. So note their letter and we'll have a discussion when we meet them.
Yeah.
Okay. Pages 311 of the meeting pack is a copy of correspondence from the Chair of the same Affairs Committee to the British Secretary of State regarding EU Artificial Intelligence Act. Are members content to note?
Yep.
Pages 313 of the meeting pack is a response from the Executive Office to committee correspondence noting that analysis of the potential cumulative effect of the Directive EU 2024-2853 on liability for defective products and other related EU acts may be an area of work for the Executive Office to consider. People content to note? Okay, pages 315 of the meeting pack is a response from the Interim Permanent Secretary of TO to committee correspondence which referred to Regulation EU 2023-988 on general product safety. Are members content to note? Okay, so Chair's business then. Just to remind members that during the meeting on the 19th of December, members agreed that I could approve the minutes of proceedings of that meeting, so to allow a link of them to be included in the 2 inquiry reports that were published that same day. So for members' information, a copy of the minutes can be found at pages 316 of the meeting pack. Next item then, so myself and David as Chair and Vice Chair met with the Permanent Secretary and the Minister of the Department for the Economy on Tuesday to just discuss the non-attendance of officials at a previous committee meeting. And as we've seen today. So during the meeting we made the point that we need departments to help us exercise our statutory functions, particularly to understand the impact of a replacement EU Act may have here, regardless of whether it involves devolved or reserved or accepted matter. So the Minister confirmed his commitment to working with the committee and recognised our role. However, he outlined the difficulties experienced by his department in relation to providing assessments of impact for EU acts that deal with reserved policy areas. He said sometimes the department has late notice of an EU Act and doesn't have the expertise to make an assessment, making officials reluctant to attend our meeting to give evidence. So when making a decision to conduct an inquiry, it's certainly helpful if we have a British Government EM, but we must have regard to whether it appears likely that a replacement act will have a significant impact specific to everyday life of communities here that's liable to persist, and therefore it's local departments who can provide best that assessment. So the Minister, obviously explained that to the Minister. The Minister said that his department will press the UK Government for early notice of EU acts and timely briefings on those relevant to reserve policy matters so that assessments can be provided where possible, and this engagement needs to take place well before an act is published and before an EM is finalised. It's not simply acceptable for departments to be waiting on a formal EM before they can conduct an assessment, like we've seen today with regard to the construction regulations. So a brief written record of the meeting will be circulated in next week's meeting pack. However, in the meantime, I'm going to propose that we write to the British Government to highlight the need for better engagement with departments here on reserved matters and request that officials here receive early notification of EU acts and timely oral and written briefings so that departments here can look at assessments of impact and then provide us as the committee, regardless of whether the matter is devolved or reserved and regardless of whether an EM has been finalised. Of Owen and then Jonathan.
Thank you, Chair, for that update. And I recall whenever this was last raised in relation to another department, I was accused of being defensive because it was an alliance minister. So I'm going to be fair to the ministers in question this time as well, because I think there is a genuine issue with how this committee is structured, where we're in a unique position whereby we are considering matters that affect both devolved and reserved matters, and so therefore we are scrutinising what are in effect reserved matters. And yes, I think it should be best endeavours with departments where they believe that they can contribute something to our scrutiny, that they come and they do that, because they're more experts in their field than we are. But there will at times be areas whereby departments simply do not have the expertise because they don't have the primary policy responsibility. And I can actually understand why an official wouldn't want to come and risk misleading the committee as part of its scrutiny work. Fundamentally, I think it's not just engagement between UK government departments and departments here at the executive, because that's almost a flaw in itself, in that you have local officials basically relying on evidence provided to them by the UK government and acting as a middleman. I actually think there's an opportunity to consider how we can better engage as a committee with UK government officials who are actually primarily responsible for this work. If we're going to scrutinise reserved matters, then we need to be able to scrutinise the officials that are looking after these policy areas. I know that that's unprecedented, but the work that we do in this committee is fairly unprecedented, and so I think there needs to be an element of flexibility both from us and from the UK government in terms of how they approach it. And I would just offer that might be a suggestion that we might want to consider or make to the UK government, that they need to look at their engagement with this committee as well directly. Appreciate not everybody may be in that space, and I have been in a slightly different position than the rest of the committee on this issue, but I think it's not just engagement from the departments locally that needs to change. There's a wider issue that we need to address.
Okay. And just before we get on to that point, myself and David, we're the same regardless of who the minister's party. We made the same arguments about the role of the committee and the expectation of officials to attend. And as we noted today, I made the point during the meeting that if officials don't attend to provide us with information, the likelihood is we would have an inquiry, in which case they would have to come. Yeah. So it's actually in their best interests to come, particularly in cases where there may be little or no impact. So with regard to your second issue, I could only offer the opinion that it's really outside the remit of this committee. We have agreed processes. It is the impact locally that requires us to make a decision, and that's based on departmental officials. So I would be swayed to the earlier process of trying to repair or improve the situation where the British government are providing our local officials with evidence. Hopefully short term we will be getting proposals. Go ahead. Yeah, no, look, I think that they're all fair points. I suppose I've always been in the space regardless of the minister. I still think it is helpful for departmental officials to come before the committee, because whilst it may be in large reserved matter, quite often a lot of these issues overlap onto other issues within a department's remit. So I'm not here to harangue officials in that regard, but I still think it is helpful for them to be here to say what they can say, and then allow the committee, because of the time restraints that we're under, to make some form of decision. On the second point, I'm not in disagreement. I think there needs to be much better coordination and engagement with UKG and this committee, and I think that is something perhaps that we can take up whenever we are engaging, whenever we're over in London. The other point that I would make on that, I think a lot of these matters are so technical, it's hard to get our heads around at the best of time. Mm-hmm. But when you're bombarded with EMs, even on the morning of your committee meeting, that's no issue with our own officials. I understand when they came. It makes it all more difficult, and I think sometimes even we need to be pushing that message back, that the updated EMs or EMs coming through on the day of the committee is just not enough time to really scrutinise some issues that may have long-lasting and significant impact. They're quite substantial pieces. The other point I would make in relation to that is sometimes an updated EM, a large section of the content is the same as the previous EM, but if you talk about speed reading, sure, but perhaps there is a mechanism by which
in formatting the updated, that we can see where the differences are, which will help sometimes the committee to draw the quicker conclusions, because I am aware that sometimes it is difficult given the time restraints to get things when we want them, but in the event of that happening, it should be easier formatted for us to try to get our heads around. So that's just some comments on what's been suggested.
The clerk has just said to me that on that issue of the changes from one EM to the next, that we've already written to them to
and ask perhaps just to have like a supplementary on the changes from the proposal to the published act.
So I have David, Steve and Peter, so in that order. David.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Echoing largely parts of what have been said, as you'll know, in the meeting that we had, I did make the point that, in my opinion, if part of the reason that officials are not able to, or are feeling that they're not able to come, is because they haven't had sufficient notice, 24 hours notice, I think was the point from UKG. I think it would be better for officials to come to committee and explain that. I know that there's eyes in Whitehall and elsewhere that follow and watch this committee, and I think they should be aware that the committee will bring people as much as we can. And I think it would be helpful if departments were to come and explain that the reason that they are unable to bring us the information that we need to make a proper decision is because they have not been given the information. And I think we've seen an example of that today, where we're getting our EMs mid-meeting. So I think it's useful for them to come and say that. We're not asking them to come and feign any level of expertise that they do not have. They can caveat it as they wish. And we will. There may be pointed questions, people trying to drag, but it's appropriate for them to say, if they come here, that's not something that I'm across at the moment. I can't answer that. We have just been given information. We haven't had time to scrutinise that, because that allows us to then say, as we have before, that we are not getting the appropriate information, or the appropriate information quickly enough from UKG. And I think that's something that so I think officials should be here. If they don't if they're not able to give answers, they should come and explain why, in my opinion. I do though think there's some merit in looking at Owen's proposal, and that, notwithstanding what the remit of the committee is, and what that allows for in terms of engaging with UKG. I think that if there are officials in UKG that we can get on Zoom that can answer questions, that if they're the appropriate authority, then I think that's something that we should consider and have conversations about the appropriateness of that with the relevant powers that be. That's not to excuse your own departments, because I think that those departments have to accept that even when they're not the responsible body for a particular regulation, they are the most appropriate relationship managers between the executive and this body and some of our stakeholders, whether that be small businesses, whether that be farmers and so on, and they will have a better idea of where the thinking will be and what might be, how regulations might affect them. So I think their input is still required and welcome, but if there are other ways we can get the information we need, I think we should investigate that. So I welcome Owen's proposal in that regard.
Okay, Steve.
Yep, so I support what Owen says, but we're coming up to a year of the Windsor Framework Democratic Scrutiny Committee, and through most of that year the EU has been sort of through Parliament process and the rest of it, sort of the volume of its legislation and legislative process has been remarkably slight. It's about to ramp up significantly, and we now are a year in and we've identified these problems, and a lot of them are communications, and that we're not getting informed by the British government quick enough, we're not getting informed by this, we're not getting informed by this. People just don't know enough information, and we're being asked for the time, because the timelines are very tight, to turn it around. I just wonder, Chair and Vice Chair, because we're just coming up to a year, might it be worth doing some kind of stock take from this committee to all the relevant stakeholders and say, look, we've been doing this for a year, here are the problems that we've seen, here's the things that worked, here's the things that haven't worked, and the rest of it, but we're a year in. And I think that would be a good opportunity for us to say, this is an evolving process. These are the kind of things we need to see to evolve. But it's only a proposal there, Chair and Vice Chair.
Okay. I'm going to ask Peter to come in, and I'm going to ask the clerk to comment on some of this stuff. Peter.
Thank you very much, Chair. I just want to concur with the comments there just made by Steve and David. I think a bit of reflection would be good, and some feedback to the people that we do communicate would be very positive. I'm frustrated. It's a very technical committee. I'm frustrated when, and again, it's as David made the point, it's no reflection on our officials, but when UKG send through EAMs and we're reading them in committee, I personally I don't think that's an acceptable way to do this. It's difficult enough with the volume and the technicality of some of the issues that we're facing into, then to be getting documents on the day of the committee that sometimes are just updates, but then we're having to read those in committee. As the clerk mentioned, that maybe this has already been fed back to UKG. I think we should feedback it again, and it might form part of a wider reflective piece in terms of lessons learned and how things could improve that Steve just mentioned. But yeah, just some thoughts, Chair. Thank you.
Okay. Or can I ask you to maybe comment on some of this stuff?
Yeah, as regards to review, as a secretariat, we have been keeping a log of issues that have arisen in relation to notifications, the types of notifications we've received, really from the very start. As I think Steve, you probably meant, I think it was you who mentioned, you know, we're coming up to that year. So I was intending to speak with Cabinet Office about those issues. They're all recorded. Perhaps provide them with a copy of it, get them to do some work in advance of me meeting with them and see if we can come to some sort of resolution. But that doesn't stop the committee now from writing again to make the point about the EMs. Before, there was a sense that, oh, we definitely need them for an inquiry, but for these reserved issues, it's become more of an issue if we don't have an EM, the departments don't have an EM. So could probably at this stage then make the point that although it's, you know, the primacy is with our local departments to provide the committee with the information, but it's extremely helpful to have the EM because it has all that sort of financial, policy, legal implications from the British government's point of view. So if members are content, we could write again, and I can schedule probably for sort of mid-end March a review with Cabinet Office officials.
Yeah, thanks very much indeed. And I fully support that, but I was thinking of something slightly wider, because this is, and I think Owen has put his finger on it, you know, this is something that's hybrid. We've never done this before. This is unique across the whole of sort of the UK and the European Union. I just think coming together with something, a formal stock take of where we are 1 year in, that goes to all the stakeholders. That includes the EU, includes the UK government, includes First and Deputy First Minister. But we lay it in, either lay it in the Assembly or lay it in the library as well, and lay it in sort of all the sort of the legislatures that are involved in this as well. Because if this is such a hybrid thing, we need to, you know, it will evolve as it goes along. And I think it'd be useful if everybody was involved. If we just deal with the Cabinet Office, it'll go round and round in circles in the Cabinet Office, and yeah, there might be some response, but I would like it to be slightly wider.
Owen?
Just to come in that point, thank you, Bree, for that clarification. That's really useful to know that at least on the sort of administrative side, there's, you know, a pathway forward. But I think there are almost broader political issues as well, and I think that's what Steve's alluding to. There is the independent review following the democratic consent vote, looking at the Windsor framework more broadly. It'd be maybe good to get an understanding how much their work will actually consider governance in the committee, because that might actually square that for us. But I do just think, and Chair, I take your point around precedent in relation to my proposals, but for me, fundamentally, the UK government decided proactively to give this committee the ability to scrutinise reserved matters, and so they need to be willing to show some flexibility and work with us if they expect us to do that role. And the other issue is, I mean, how many times have we been here and we've had Northern Ireland executive officials and we've been asking, well, what about divergence? And they say, well, it depends what the UK government decides to do. What is the UK government going to do? Well, we can't speak for the UK government. And actually, those are examples of times when actually you need to be speaking to a UK government official to really understand the direction of travel and to make an informed assessment. There's no point us sitting here trying to guess what the UK government might do in the future. So, like, I think the UK government's engagement with this committee, I would actually go a step further. I think it's been wholly inadequate and has been insulting at times with the manner in which information has arrived. We weren't able to reach a conclusion in relation to a regulation before Christmas because of poor provision of information and papers landing late. And we've seen that in this meeting, papers arrive in mid-meeting. It's not acceptable, and it's not a good way to do business, and I think we need to be as robust with the UK government as we have been with our own ministers.
I concur.
Okay.
I think it's worth saying as well that even we have at times come to decision, it's been without the fullness of information that you would like, but you've had enough concerns or whatever one way or the other, but actually still at times things missing.
Go ahead.
Okay, I just want to clarify because it's quite a lot of talk in there. So members are content with the Secretariat and the Cabinet Office conducting our sort of wider review, and as a first step, ask about the review on foot of the democratic consent motion, and ask particularly whether this particular structure will be included as part of that review. And that then you're content that is done rather as a first step. And somebody had mentioned, sorry, I'm not sure who it was, about the fact that witnesses here can't speak on behalf of the British government or the UK government. So are you content that I explore with Cabinet Office the possibility of witnesses from UK government departments in situations where reserve matters? Now, as you're aware,
sorry, you want to finish your point?
I was just going to say there's no obligation unless we're doing an inquiry for them to engage.
And the other point is I wouldn't want individual departments to feel that they can use that card not to come before
yes.
the
That's true too.
Because as I've said, sometimes a reserve matter can have other implications on other devolved policies.
Yeah, I think I suppose it's maybe a case of playing that by ear. You mightn't then get a witness for in time for the committee making a decision on whether to conduct an inquiry, unless that can be arranged very quickly when we realise that departments aren't going. But you could certainly use it, or consider using it to supplement evidence during an inquiry.
Sure, if I could, I think rather than we're all thinking of here really, I think maybe in particular in relation to the witnesses aspect, perhaps maybe yourself and the team can take that away and look into what is possible. And that one decision doesn't bind another decision down the line.
Yeah.
And then the committee or the parties and the individual members can delve into that whenever it comes to reading their papers at the next meeting.
Okay, so I'll take those three issues away.
I think it's worth saying, actually, going back to the meeting that we had, we did, and I think the Minister accepted and understood, that we did reinforce that point, that even where the idea of they wouldn't be allowed to shield behind that, in terms of, and he said that they had no intention of doing that, that he would provide them where they could. So I think we made that point even in general in terms of the issue that we were discussing, that departments would still be required to come and give their evidence, and committee will still want the information that it can get. It wouldn't be a case of just coming and saying, sorry folks, we're not able to speak to any of that. We would still require the same level of engagement that we have whenever they do attend.
Okay, so the clerk has read out how we're going to proceed with that, and and this is a kind of a political point that I'm going to make, because we're talking about the credibility of others. When we do have departmental officials coming before us and saying clearly that something doesn't have an impact, and then we're holding an inquiry to bring them back to say the same thing next week, I think we just need to question our own credibility.
It does impact our credibility.
So. Okay. We're happy enough then just to move forward in relation to that. So, any other business? Nobody has any other business. Okay, date, time, place of next meeting. Just to inform members that the next committee meeting is scheduled for next Thursday, the 16th at 10 a.m. in the room, and I'm just going to adjourn the meeting.
Committee Room 30. Sound. Committee Room 30. Sound. Committee Room 30. Sound. Committee Room 30, 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 sound. Committee Room